continue this discussion around the big squeeze, though. And many parents can't afford to send their children to private schools because it's just too expensive. So the option of moving to government schools has now become more of a reality. And joining us now to discuss this kind of sort of change in behavior is Anne Baker. She's from the National Alliance of Independent Schools Associations, and Hendrik Makaneta, who's an education activist. To both of you, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for coming in. I mean, this is an important discussion just around what people understand about, you're calling it independent schools, and most people will call it private schools. The cost of going to an independent school versus the cost of going to a government school. What's your experience?
I think it depends on which schools you're talking about. There's a wide range of independent. I use the word independent because that's how the South African Schools Act names it. They don't call it a private school. And fees can be very low or very high. So we have this wide range of school fees. As I said to you, some school fees are less than some public schools. So, for instance, in Johannesburg, I can tell you there are public schools charging 51,800 Rand per annum, 40,000 Rand per annum. There are many independent schools that charge far less than that.
All right, let's perhaps, just for the ease of this discussion, let's perhaps say that the top schools in Johannesburg, for example, the top independent schools that people are wanting to send their children to, those would be sort of in the top tiers of the school fees that we're talking about.
Yes, some of them are very expensive.
Yeah, and what are we talking about there?
80,000 Rand a year, 90, even over 100,000 Rand a year. But now we're talking a very niche market.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a whole broad band of more middle-of-the-road independent schools.
So, Hendrik, I mean, if you think about it, perhaps it's around our mentality as parents. We want to send our children to good schools, and often that would mean that top tier that Anne is talking about, that niche group of schools charging anything from 80 to more per year.
Yeah, precisely. And in the main, if you look at it, that is where the high level of education takes place, because in a classroom you might find that in such a school you have got about less than 15 kids in one classroom. You know, or even 12 children in that class. So the teacher is able to focus on the on the kids, but also there's high level of discipline in such schools. Whereas there are also schools that she's talking about, which will cost some, around 3,000 per month or 2,500. Those are some of the independent schools which are found in some of the townships within the country. You know, they are affordable for, in most cases, middle class, but of course there are many other people who are unable to afford. You know, even those who are unable to afford still send them to those township schools because they believe education will be better there, as opposed to township schools where literally teaching and learning has, ceased to exist.
But I mean, that might be the case in some or perhaps even many instances, but it doesn't mean that just because you're going to a public school you're going to get a lesser quality of education.
Yeah, of course not. It also does not mean that you are going to get necessarily the best. You know, it varies. You know, there may be good teachers who are found in public schools, and you might have bad teachers found also in the private schools. But I'm just saying that in terms of monitoring the performance of teachers, teaching and learning, it's quite easier to monitor them in a private school than in a public school. You know, because in most of the private schools you find that there is no existence of unions, for example. You find that there's no SATU there, there's no, people are managers are free to deal with issues of discipline, whereas in the public space, it's difficult, you know. Even if a teacher does not go to class, you know, it's not always easy to get rid of them, unlike in the private schools. That is where the distinction is. But in the main, I think that we are concerned about the high level of, exorbitant fees that are charged, because some of the schools charge more than what a university would charge for an annual tuition. And, you know, you ask yourself a question. We've made a call in the past to say government must regulate, the manner in which schools charge fees. It does not really make sense that in one school, which is not far from the other, learners are paying 150,000 rand per annum, and in the other school, they are paying 30,000. It does not really make a lot of sense, because if you look, you can't measure that, the difference in terms of what they offer. Just like in universities, you find that LLB will cost more at the University of Pretoria than at the, let's say, Limpopo, University of Limpopo, for instance, whereas it's the same qualification. And we think government since 1994 has not been able to tap into this situation to try and regulate, mainly because of the institutional autonomies that exist. They are free to do whatever they want at universities, but also private schools. They've got their own way of doing things, as opposed to public schools, which are more regulated.
Would you agree with that, Anne, that you can't regulate the level of education you're getting?
Independent schools are highly regulated, and in some cases more regulated than public schools. They have to be accredited with the body Umulusi, which requires a whole lot. If they are subsidized, there are huge requirements from departments of education in the provinces. So in some cases, I'd go so far as to say there's more compliance required than in some public schools.
Yeah.
So I don't agree at all. In fact, it's the independent sector, and I talk about the formal independent sector, is very monitored. And there are standards which the associations ask them to abide by, so that they do things of quality. But to get back to trying to regulate fees, it's parental choice. And I think
that parental choice is based on me wanting to give my child the best chance at life.
Yes.
But does that mean, because I'm paying more fees, that my child's going to get a better education?
It depends.
Yeah.
It all depends on, just because you're paying fees doesn't mean your child can do well at school if they're struggling.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing that some parents think. If I pay enough money, I can get better. I think that the big thing is that a lot of it is faith-based choice.
Yeah.
As well as what you said, small classes. And
more attention.
Yeah. Yes, regulation of the teachers is easier in that they fall under the Labour Relations Act and the basic conditions of employment, as opposed to being state employees.
So on the one hand, the argument might be, if I spend more money on my child's education, they're going to get a better level of education, they get a better quality of education. But on the other hand, that might not be the case, and that might be a comfort now to middle-class earners who can't afford exorbitant fees and are now choosing to put their children into public schools.
I think we've got to honour that this country cannot survive without good public schools. And I think that's where the argument gets a little bit muddied, because public schools must be good. The citizens of South Africa deserve that. Yeah. Citizens that choose to send their children to independent schools for whatever reason also need to be protected, which is now why we have such high protectionism in place for independent schools. So I don't think it's one against the other. It's choice. I choose one thing for my children. There might be some muddle that just because I'm independent, we're better. And I would go so far as to say there are some, especially the ones that are not affiliated to our associations, who are far from better.
Yeah,
and parents are silly to send their children.
Yeah, and there's also a distinction there. If you look at Oprah Winfrey School of Leadership Academy, when you check the manner in which they accept, the admission policy there, they accept the best, the best learners into the school. And, South Africans believe, of course, that is the best school. Yes, it is the best, mainly because they accept the best. Mm-hmm. So there are private schools which accept any child. You'll find that, they just take any child. They don't go through the necessary tests, diagnosis to check the performance.
As long as you can pay the exorbitant.
As long as parents can pay. And those are the schools that we have a problem with. Because what they do is that you own a school which is registered with ISASA, for example. All you do, you are in business. And, you just take kids. Whether the kids are able to perform or not, you just accept them as long as their parents pay. And at the end of the day, you find that, there's also a high failure rate in such a school. And, those are the kind of schools that we have a problem with because they are not really interested in providing, quality education. As long as parents pay, then that's fine. Then you find that the parents of that child who is doing well in the school can be excluded financially, even if the child is producing. Yes.
I think I just need to correct one thing. ISASA is a member of the National Alliance of Independent Schools Association, and like all the members, have strict conditions for being a member. So that wouldn't be an ISASA school that would do that. It would be more what we call chain schools or for-profit schools.
For-profit schools.
And a lot of the schools, most of our schools are not for-profit. So I think we have to be very careful. This is a very hazy landscape, and it needs a lot of understanding. The other thing is that many teachers in the independent schools get paid less than in the public sector because they can't charge as high fees. So I'm talking about the middle and the lower. But a lot of those teachers are very committed to their vocation as a teacher. So they might get better results because of the care and the concern that the teachers place on the learner.
Well, thank you to both of you. I wish we had more time to continue to unpack what is really such an important issue. Parents wanting the best for their children, not always being able to afford those top-tier schools. Anne Baker is from the National Alliance of Independent Schools Associations, and Hendrik Makaneta is an education activist. Thank you both for coming into studio.
Thank you.